Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to a very, very special edition of PhotoJoseph's Photo Moment. I am your host, PhotoJoseph, and today we are going to be talking with my good friend, Matt Frazer, who is a representative from Panasonic, who is here today to tell us all about the S1H, get the right camera, and not just tell us about it, but answer your tough questions about it. Now, I just realized that my title card has totally disappeared off screen, which is excellent planning. Love when that happens. So while I'm fuddling around with that, make sure that you are heading over to photojoseph.com/live, which is where you can submit your questions. I'm just going to switch over to the interview card and hope that my title card comes back up, which it has not. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Matt Frazer. Say hello to him. Matt, how you doing today?
Good, Joseph. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. It's so good to have you on here. Thank you so much for coming in. I am struggling to figure out why my title card has suddenly disappeared the moment that we started the live show, but I will figure that out while we are getting into the first part of this. So first of all, thanks again for coming on. This is really awesome. Hopefully there's going to be a lot of people who are asking some really good, tough questions about the S1H, which is what we want. But let's start with a little bit of just an overview of what the camera is and why it exists in this lineup. We are, of course, talking about the S1H, which is the latest full-frame addition to the S series from Panasonic LUMIX. It is the full-frame one that is designed for video users, complementing the S1 and the S1R. So on top of that, how would you position this camera against those other two, and who is the target market for this camera?
Yeah, I think when we first launched the S-series cameras, there was a little bit of a question as to what we were trying to do. I think a lot of people were expecting the S1 to be kind of a GH camera as a full frame, and then the S1R to be more like G9 in a full frame camera.
Sure.
And ultimately, we had this 3-act play, and everybody thought that we were just in 1 act when we launched those 2 cameras. So we ultimately look at these cameras as having 3 distinctly different markets.
Okay.
We look at the S1. The S1R is a terrific photo camera with tremendous resolution. When you add in the high-res shot functionality to get 187 megapixel still photographs, it offers functionality that a lot of still cameras just aren't capable of.
Sure.
The S1 was ultimately that hybrid camera. So somebody who is doing a lot of professional photography or high-end enthusiast photography, but also wants a very capable video camera as well. That's where the S1 really fills that niche. And it provides us with a camera that fills most of the needs of the YouTube community, the wedding videography and wedding photography communities, professional photography communities. Its resolution's about where most people want their cameras to be for that stuff. So it worked out really well for that.
Okay.
With the S1H, we're really, in my opinion, aspiring to a higher level of production than what we were even doing with the GH5 or GH5S by offering functionality like an open gate sensor, which is using the entire 3:2 aspect ratio of the sensor to capture video and allow you to crop later. Also gives you the ability to use really high-end anamorphic lenses to cover that entire 3:2 sensor. Those things are very unique in this particular space. In fact, some companies are just now introducing cameras that are full-frame cinema cameras, and they still don't even have an open gate function that can compete with what the S1H offers. So I would say that for somebody who's aspiring for a very high level of production, or they ultimately see themselves into a production camera like a Vericam, or if they're looking at an Alexa or a Red, this is a great step in between those cameras.
Okay. Got it. Makes sense. Well, since I can't seem to get my lower third to come back up, I don't know, maybe at some point something magical will happen. I want to make sure that everybody knows who's watching live that to ask questions, you need to go to photojoseph.com/live. Submit your questions there, and those questions can be upvoted. So if you see a question that you want to answer as well, make sure you click on that and upvote that. So let's just talk very quickly about the price point, and then I see there are already some questions coming in. The camera is priced at $4,000, which I know compared to many other full-frame cameras, and certainly the Micro Four Thirds cameras, a lot of people look at it and say, well, that's kind of expensive. But then, of course, when you compare it to the RELXs, the Red, the other cameras that are, in many cases, not doing anything that much different than this, it seems like an incredible bargain. So on one regard, it's kind of overpriced. In another regard, it's totally underpriced. So how do you position that? Where do you think of the camera as far as pricing goes?
Well, I don't know that there's a direct competitor in the DSLR or DSLM space that's offering this level of functionality. So it's difficult when you compare it against other full-frame DSLR cameras or mirrorless cameras. nobody's offering the feature set that this camera has. Nobody's offering the kind of data rates we're doing for all intra codecs with this camera. Nobody's really offering internal 10-bit 422. Clearly no one's offering 6K. So it's a difficult camera to compare against those products. It's much more appropriate to compare it against more of the cinema products. So if you look at the low end of the cinema world, you can look at a Blackmagic Pocket 6K, which is a nice camera. I'm sure it produces a beautiful image. I have not yet got a chance to try one out, so I'm not going to sit here and say it does, but I'm going to give them full benefit of the doubt. Everything I've seen looks fantastic on the camera. But ultimately, you are stuck in a Super 35 sensor size. You don't have the larger canvas of a full-frame camera. You're looking at a camera that's about $2,500. We're at $4,000. Typically, when you step to full-frame, that's about the price differential between APS-C and full-frame. So it's not as if we're overpriced. We're right where we need to be in terms of full-frame versus APS-C on the budget end of the spectrum.
Got it.
When you start to compare it against cameras that are full-frame centered cameras that can do the things we can do, now you're really looking at the Sony Venice. We're talking about the Arri Alexa LF. And to a certain extent, the Red Monstro 8K VV. And those cameras are, $50,000, $40,000, up to six figures.
Yeah.
And they do things we don't. I'm not going to sit here and try to say that we're a better camera. Arri Raw is a real thing, and it really does look awesome, and it gives it a pretty amazing image. But for the bulk of what production needs, they're going to get 80 to 90% of what they would experience with one of those cameras with this product. And if you're looking to get into full-frame imagery, but you already own a Vericam, or you have an Alexa, or you have a Red that's not full-frame, oftentimes people find that those full-frame shots tend to be more specialized, trying to create shallow depth of field looks, trying to give buildings a greater scale or a bit greater sense of size and dimensionality. But they still tend to fall back on Super 35 for the bulk of their productions. So this allows you to add a secondary camera and use it for your full-frame looks and continue to use your Arri or your Vericam as your primary camera in Super 35.
Right, and they do mix beautifully. I don't remember the name of it. What is it called? The color profiling that you can do with this camera to make it match cinema cameras basically flawlessly.
Yeah, so this is where things get a little complicated because it's sort of new terminology for sort of the YouTube consumer level or even like the mid-tier professional. So if you use a program called DaVinci Resolve or you're using Baselight, which are the two predominant production color correction tools that are used for Hollywood or television production, when you ingest Vlog or if you ingest C-Log from Canon or Log-C from Arri or you ingest Red, these cameras have a much wider color space than what any deliverable is capable of. Your television standard is Rec 2020 for the color space, but there aren't even TVs that can do that yet. So, hey, you got it up.
I finally found it. I don't know. Anyway, yes, it's finally up now.
All right. So we're working at cameras that have a much wider color space than what we can currently deliver. And the Academy of Motion Picture Sciences recognized that there's a need to be able to archive footage with its inbuilt color space, or as much color space as we can provide. So they developed the ACES standard for color science and color capture. So effectively, when you bring in your log footage and it's V-gamut in this camera, what we then can do is we can run it through DaVinci Resolve, or we can bring it into Baselight, and we can say we want to convert this from Vlog V-gamut to ACES. And once we've done that conversion, it uses something called an IDT that expands the color space out into the ACES color space. And with a little magic from our engineers, we hit the color primaries and secondaries that they require for ACES protocol. And now you have a camera that matches another camera that has an IDT for ACES as well. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you they're a 100% perfect match. There's going to be dynamic range differences. There'll be subtleties in color. But you get a very significant matching camera at that point. And the best part is that now when you archive that and you store it, you now know that you have a pristine archived file that can then be used for different color standards as we change and evolve. This also means that when we're working on set, let's say I have a DIT, somebody who's on set that is a data wrangler, and they're setting up the cart, and they're making sure that we can see looks on set. Well, the great thing about ACES is that it can be transformed into different looks for different monitors. So let's say on set we have a Rec 709 monitor. Terrific. We can bring in, ingest as ACES, and then output as Rec 709 to that monitor that's being used by our director. If we have a P3 monitor, we can output as P3. If we happen to have a Rec 2020 device, we were at the Dolby Vine Theater, that was a Dolby Vision system. It can do like 99% Rec 2020. We could output that in that scenario and show it as well. So it gives you a lot of monitoring flexibility. It allows us to do color corrections very easily based on the limitations of what we have to work with, but can still deliver pristine P3 or Rec 2020. So I know this is a lot of information, but I think it's important for people to understand that the future will ultimately be working within an ACES workflow, and you're going to see more and more editing software and color correction software incorporating ACES. And the nice thing about shooting with the S1H is that because it is a match to what Vericam and EVA do, and because we already made the investment in an IDT for those cameras, the byproduct of this is that the S1H works within an ACES workflow.
Great.
And this means that you don't have to work with Panasonic cameras. We'd love it if you did, but you can work with, if you already have an Arri, you already have a Red, if you're already shooting F65, F55, you can bring those cameras into a similar color space and still get matches.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks for that. It's a good technical background. I know for a lot of viewers are probably more on the YouTube side of things that may not apply to them, but knowing that the same camera that they may buy today will be compatible when they step into a whole different world like that is pretty great. Let's jump into the questions here so we get some good ones coming in. Tyler Penrod is asking, essentially, why are there no built-in ND filters? He says, I love what the camera has to offer. It's an incredible achievement for the price and form factor, but I think a lot of the market would have paid extra and been okay with a thicker body to get those built-in NDs.
Well, we can't really make it thicker because we're on the L mount. So you have to think, if my mount is here and my sensor is here, and I have 20 millimeters to work with, if I put a shutter mechanism for the photography side, that shutter mechanism is taking space.
Sure.
So I'd either have to remove the shutter mechanism and then design something from scratch that can add that ND functionality, which would have been a nice compromise.
Sure.
But ultimately, it would have sacrificed the photo quality of the camera in order to add neutral density.
Right.
So the first thing is that there just is not enough space in that 20 millimeter flange back distance for us to be able to integrate an optical system.
Right.
Now, we could have theoretically done an electronic system like I think some of the Sony FS series products have an electronic ND that's in place, and then it's continuously variable. It's really nothing more than an LCD television panel, very small, and you just change the polarity, and it pneumatically twists the crystals, and then it creates density. But that's always in place all the time. It doesn't move out of the way and come back in.
Right.
And even when it's a 0 ND pass, it still robs us of light.
Okay.
So had we done that, first off, it would have been exponentially more expensive. I just want to make sure that's clear. But it also would have robbed us of light gathering. So in the long run, we've made the decision that the shutter mechanism is more important for the hybrid shooting aspects of the camera and to maintain high image quality for photography. So that's why the shutter stays.
Got it. And
we don't get to an ND system.
Is it possible, and maybe this even exists, if you're adapting third-party lenses, clearly with the L-mount lenses this wouldn't work, but say you're adapting a Canon or a Cine lens or whatever, you have space in that adapter, right? Those adapters are usually quite thick. Could those have some type of ND either drop-in or some type of variable ND, electronic variable ND, that could fit in there in between them? So someone wanted to make an EF to L-mount adapter with the variable ND built into it. Is that technically possible?
Yeah, there's no technical reason why you couldn't do that. Now, powering it might be a little bit different subject when it comes to powering a variable ND. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know how much electricity, how much voltage and current is available through the pin connections to be able to power something like that.
Got it.
But ultimately, you could just tap in another battery if you wanted something like that.
Okay.
And I think it's Aperture, one of the companies that does a lot of lighting and adapters. They already build adapters that are EF to micro four thirds that have inbuilt electronic NDs. So It's certainly something that's micro four thirds to EF, or sorry, EF to micro four thirds is available.
Okay.
I would assume that there's other people looking at the L mount and saying, hey, there's an opportunity for, capitalism is capitalism. People will look for ways to sell it if there's people who want to buy it. So
Gotcha.
I would expect to see that happen.
Okay, awesome, thank you. All right, next question comes from Joe Castro, and I know that you can't comment on any future plans that have not yet been announced. So this is going to be pretty open-ended and possibly I can't answer this question, but he's simply asking, will there be a firmware update? And obviously there will be firmware updates because there always are, but will there be one specifically to address the autofocus, to improve the autofocus over time? Now, before you answer it, I want to kind of pre-answer it by saying Panasonic is obviously always trying to make things better, and if they find a way to make things better, they most certainly will. But are there any plans that are public that you can speak to? And a simple yes or no is fine for this.
Our focus is already perfect.
Of course it is.
So the reality is we're always enhancing. We're always looking to improve. So it's Kaizen. That's the Japanese term for continuous improvement. We are always going to try to improve the autofocus system and make it better. I do think people need to be trying to be polite here. I think in some ways people are expecting things out of very shallow depth of field lenses that are incredibly difficult to achieve even with the best autofocus systems. Now, I'm not going to say that we're as good at 50 millimeters f1.4 as some of our competitors, but I will say that at 50 millimeters f1.4 on my competitors' products, there are challenges with those autofocus systems staying in focus. They may do it quicker than we do, but they run in struggles as well. Whereas if you're using a 24-105 f4, our system works extremely well with that 24-105 f4. It works really well with the 24-70 f2.8 that we're about to launch in, sometime in October. So without that really shallow depth of field and longer focal length, and if you think about where the most useful uses are for autofocus, especially for the cinema community that we're targeting with the S1H, it's typically going to be on a gimbal shot or a Steadicam shot. And those shots are typically not long telephoto with shallow depth of field.
Right.
They're usually going to be somewhere between an f4 to 5.6 split or an f6 to f8 split. And they're going to usually be a wider angle lens. And in those situations, the S1H's autofocus is perfectly fine. And we're hearing very good reports of it being used in those applications. It's when we start to see some of the YouTube applications where you've got a 50 millimeter f1.4 and you got somebody jumping in and out of frame. Trying to trick the system or running back and forth into the camera. No, we're not going to be as good at that. But we're going to always try to improve and make it better. I think people have to sort of look at what a realistic use case is for the autofocus system when you're targeting a cinematic customer. So
and I think that's a big part of it. It is
like me trying to sorry, go ahead.
No, I said that is a big part of it. It really is the cinematic customer. And like you were about to say, it's not to apologize for it or anything, but the primary market for this camera is not interested in autofocus at all. They're most likely going to be using cameras that are manual focus to begin with, so it's just not really relevant.
I can promise you this, Joseph. It has much better autofocus than the Barrycam. Because it actually has autofocus.
There you go.
Most of the cinema cameras don't have autofocus.
Right, exactly.
So, and again, I don't want to marginalize this. I don't want to sit here and say that it's not an important consideration. We would love to be all things to every segment of the market. Autofocus is an area that we'll continue to work to improve so that we can be all things to all customers.
Very good. Thank you for that. Nice, good, political, easy answer. All right, we're going to jump. There's a bunch more questions coming in, which is awesome. Thank you, everybody. I want to remind viewers that not only can you submit questions, but you can upvote questions that are there. So as we get more and more questions, and we may not possibly get to them all, if you're upvoting the ones that you are interested in, that will prioritize them and make sure that we get them asked. With that said, we're going to move on to a question from Chris Whitskall. He says, I've been a Panasonic user since 2013 in the GH3. Thank you very much, Chris. Does Panasonic have any plans to allow continuous shooting when using flash? Okay, so we're into a stills question here. It seems to be absent in the S series and not available with all micro four thirds cameras I have tried, or I have tried. I know you're more on the video side of things, so maybe you don't have an answer to that. I know from my experience, it's not a limitation in the camera. It's simply about how quickly the flash can recycle. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Matt.
So with the GH5 and the GH5, GH5S, if you use the FL580 flash, not the 360L, but if you use the FL580, you do get to continuous burst with that flash.
Okay, and I think it's just a recycle time issue. I mean, you know, if you're shooting at full power.
Intensity and recycle.
Right. Yeah. I don't think there's any limitation in the camera itself. So, Chris, if that's something you want to follow up on in the future, you can hit me up on Twitter or somewhere else, and I'll dig into that a little bit more. But I don't think there's any limitation other than the recycle time on the flash. Ryan Andrew Bruce says, I'm really curious about how the colors of the S1H relate to the S1, especially in 10-bit 422 vlog. Basically, if I get an S1H to go with my S1, is it going to be hard to match them?
It's going to be terrible. We didn't think of that. I'm joking. So I want to be clear. When you pay for the Filmmaker upgrade, which is the SFU2 software,
right,
which we're giving away free right now, so keep in mind it's free on the S1.
Is it still? Is it? Didn't that free end at the end of September, end of October?
I checked. We're still running it.
Oh, so. Okay. So if you haven't got the upgrade for your S1 yet, get it quick.
Yeah. So what I want to make sure everybody understands is that it's the same vlog and vgamut that you get in the S1H, which is the same as the EVA1. It's the same as the VariCam. So image quality-wise, the S1 and the S1H are going to be extraordinarily similar. And so that makes the S1 an incredible value in terms of image quality and dynamic range. I want to make sure people understand that there's a lot of features you get with the S1H that either help speed production, make cropping easier in post. They clearly have anamorphic functionality that you just don't do in the S1. But ultimately, the image quality when using the same lens is going to be the same.
Virtually identical, yeah.
So so it'll match beautifully, no problems at all.
Yeah, and especially I think if you're shooting vlog, then you have that flexibility for if there's any reason that things don't match, maybe a slight difference in the lens, that it should be quite easy to make them match. Excellent.
And Joseph, I want to point out one thing also. So for what I end up shooting for Panasonic, which is ultimately a lot of just how-to videos and corporate stuff, the S1 is all I would probably ever need.
Right.
And so for me, I don't know that I would invest in an S1H. I think personally for me, an S1 is a better choice. Now, aspirationally, I would much rather be doing movies and doing cinematic look stuff. And if that was the look I was going for, the S1H clearly has the advantage.
Sure.
And so I just want to make sure people know that S1 is a really exceptional video camera when you get that 10-bit and vlog and vgamut upgrade. And it still offers features that none of my competitors offer in this segment. Things like the ability to load your own LUTs and to have a waveform monitor function inbuilt. Those are things you just don't see from other companies. Right. And this still works within an ACES workflow, which means matching it to other cameras is just as simple as matching an S1H.
Okay. Interesting. That's good to know. I will throw out there, you say that like for yourself, the S1 is fine, the aspirational for the S1H. I will say, though, even just as doing YouTube videos like these, not live, but videos like these that are edited, to me, the big advantage of having the S1H is to be able to not do 24p 3.2 open gate. That's not what interests me. It's being able to do that larger than 4K 16:9 aspect ratio. So the 5.9K in 16:9, so that I can deliver a video in 4K, but still have room to punch into the shot. Even if I'm doing a talking head like this and I need to edit something out, having the ability to punch in instead of just a hard cut, which generally I know is very popular on YouTube, you just cut. But if I'm going to cut, I'd rather have a little bit of a camera shift. Then to me, that's huge. So it allows me to have that flexibility and deliver in 4K, which is, to me, that's a big deal. So for the YouTube side of things, it is quite advantageous to be able to shoot in 6K for those who want to deliver in 4.
Well, and I think that DP Review did a really nice job with Jordan.
Yeah, Jordan's video is great.
Yeah, his video was very funny, but what I thought was most interesting was when they did the open gate shooting interview and they cut in and did these multiple cuts to show the way that you can get different looks with a single camera angle. And this is nothing new. I mean, you can do this at 4K now on a 1080 deliverable. Right. You just have more room to be able to do this. And now you actually have some room, if your deliverable is going to be 4K, to be able to punch this in.
Right. Excellent. Blas has a question. He says, what is the technical limitation for full-frame cameras to record at 50 FPS or higher in 4K or higher without cropping? I'd like to know if there will be some way to record 4K 50 full-frame, so without crop, for instance, using the HDMI output.
So we have a UK contributor there, I believe.
Absolutely. Coming in at 4K 50, yeah.
So for us dumb Americans, it would also be 60p affected as well. this really ultimately comes down to readout speed of the sensor.
And sorry, before you answer, just to make sure everybody watching is on the same page here. So the reason this question comes up is because if you're shooting 4K 30, you can shoot using the entire full frame sensor. If you go to 4K 60, you punch into a Super 35 crop. Correct? Is that
That's
correctly
correct.
stated?
So,
okay.
Yeah, and this is not unique to our camera.
Sure.
In fact, it's not unique even in the cinema space. There are just now beginning to see cameras that can do full frame 4K 60 without having to do a punch in. This comes down to readout speed of the camera and processing power. So, I'm sorry, readout speed of the sensor and processing power. So we could absolutely supply a full frame sensor that could read out faster and give us a 60 frame readout speed. I can promise you this, the camera would get exponentially more expensive.
Right.
Because we would have to have more tap points on the sensor for being able to quickly gather the information and get it into the engine for processing. This would also mean more processing power would be required because we can't wait for it to come down as an array. So you're going to have to buffer. You're going to buffer your first group of images from the top of the sensor, the next group, the next group, the next group. So there'd be more taps coming in through it to be able to do that. And ultimately, the sensor would get much more expensive. The camera would get much more expensive. I mean, if you want that sort of speed of readout, you know, the Sony Venice can do that in a full frame. And it still has some rolling shutter. It's not a global sensor.
It's not
but
global, right?
It does a better job than this. But keep in mind, it's a $40,000+ camera before you add monitoring or any viewfinders or anything like that. When you look at cameras that are like the Red Epic camera, that camera can do full sensor readout 4K 60, but what you end up with is a camera with a lot of rolling shutter. In some ways even worse than the S1H from what I've seen. So that's not a disparagement of it. That camera's doing 8K. I mean, it's a monster.
Right,
it's a great camera. But there's some limitations given the sensor that they've worked with. So I think people have to understand that if we're going to keep a CMOS system that produces the low light sensitivity and dynamic range we get, there's going to be some compromises. And if we were to try to do 60 frame, it would just be impossibly bad rolling shutter, or the sensor might not even be able to do it at all.
Got it.
So that brings us to like global sensors and the things that could maybe improve this. But what you have to understand is that when you see global sensor products, or somebody says a global shutter, they're either putting an electronic it's an electronic simulation of a mechanical shutter.
Okay.
So it's like one of those LCD panels, and it's literally cycling off and on. Well, that's costing you light gathering, so you get worse low light sensitivity. Or what they're doing is they're splitting the diodes. So every photodiode gets split in half. They add a capacitor so that they can offload the diode information onto the capacitor and then send it down the array. Now you've cut your low light sensitivity in half because your diode's half the size. So this is all about a balancing act between what price point can we hit, what's really important for the shooter who's in this segment, and how much low light and dynamic range we can get.
Right.
In this case, we simply can't give you a fast enough readout speed while maintaining the same dynamic range, the same low light sensitivity. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's...
and by the way, there will be no firmware that adds this. There will be nothing. There will be no HDMI out that can do this. It's a sensor limitation, and it's the readout speed of the sensor. And keep in mind, you're seeing a lot of cameras that have full frame sensors, and none of them in this segment can do that.
Right.
So the fact that we have a crop that can still give you a 4K 60 out is very unique in the full frame space. Nobody else is really offering this. I think only the Canon 1DX Mark II has the ability to do 4K 60 from a large region of the sensor, and that's a substantially more expensive camera even than the S1H.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. You mentioned global shutter. Because I know people may not be familiar with that term, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, current sensors read out line by line. A global sensor will read the entire sensor at once, which would, in theory, eliminate the need for a physical shutter, even for flash photography. Is that all correct?
Correct. So when we talk about how a sensor reads, if it's a CMOS, typically line one, this is a very dumbed down, easy explanation. So line one gets captured, and then it has to be handed down to line 2, line 3, line 4, all the way down to the bottom line, so it can then go out and be put into the engine. Then line 2 gets addressed down, then line 3 gets addressed down. So really what's happened is line 1 goes to line 2, then line 3, then line 2 is captured, and then the 2 go down like this, and then so on and so forth. Right. So it's that rolling address. So the more taps you have, if we're tapping early, we can pull that information off faster, giving us faster readout speeds, but then that adds processing power requirements, buffering requirements. When we're talking about a global sensor, there's some way to allow the address to happen together. So there's nothing that limits a CMOS from capturing the entire image at the same time. There's just no way to address it down the buffer all at once.
I see.
So you have to do it in segments. The way that you offset this in the modern global sensors that are out is you put a storage device, a capacitor, because really it's just voltage. That's all that the diode is capturing. It's capturing a voltage value. It's like your solar panel. That's what this is. So it brings in the voltage value. If I can dump it onto a storage capacitor, then I can capture everything at one time, offload to the storage capacitor, and then we can roll it down in its normal sequence before we capture the next frame. But that requires storage capacitors,
right,
which means we have to remove some diode material to do it.
Got it.
So
okay,
that's really nerdy conversation.
No, I know, but it's still it's interesting, and it's a hint of things to come from the industry. It's interesting to see where things are going. All right, let's move on to the next question. Tyler, by the way, saying thank you for the explanation of the neutral density. It makes perfect sense to him. That's awesome. Cinegane says, I just want to say I'm glad the cameras do 24p. Well, you're quite welcome. Chris says, you seemed to allude to an autofocus improvement in the 24 to 70 versus the 24 to 105. He said, is that true?
No. I can't. I haven't tested the two to be able to tell you that one is better than the other.
Okay.
The 24 to 70 and 24 to 105, from my experience, are about the same in terms of the way that their autofocus performs. There's not a lot to reveal in the 24 to 70 at this point, so I can't comment. And to be honest, I haven't tested the two side by side. So what I'm telling you is just from my limited time working with it. You had the same. You probably had more time working with it at the event at the Goya Studios that I had to work with it, and from my experience, it's close to the 24 to 105.
Got it. Okay. I want to remind everybody who's watching, again, that all the questions are being submitted at this URL right here below me, photojoseph.com/live. If you have a question to ask, don't drop it into the chat over at YouTube. I am in there chatting to you to say, don't do it here. Go over to photojoseph.com/live. That's where we want to see the questions, and that way people can upvote the questions as well and add to that if they have follow-up questions to it. So head over there to submit your questions. Going back to that still photography, Chris is chiming in again to say thanks for answering the non-S1H question. So apparently the Panasonic cameras, like the S1H, actually disable continuous shooting when attaching a flash. That's what he's saying. So it might be, maybe it works with the Panasonic flash. I will have to check that out. Chris, I'll check that out afterwards. Do me a favor, hit me up on Twitter at PhotoJoseph afterwards. Remind me that you asked this question, and I will try to understand a little bit more about what is going on in there.
So Joseph, what we should do is get you an FL580. Because that's the flash that's supposed to enable that.
Yeah, I've got one.
So that'd be the way to test it.
Okay. Yeah, I have the FL580 and I have some Godox flashes as well. So it'll be interesting to see if there is a difference in there on the S1. We'll definitely do that. Cinegane, I'm not sure if this is a question or if he's just being funny. Maybe you'll, because I don't understand the question completely. But he says, where's all that organic sensor and global shutter tech? Is that a real thing? I don't know if this is a real question. I'm just reading off the screen here.
So the Panasonic elves are in the tree right now, and they're working hard on getting you the global sensor. And so we have made some public pronouncements of a new sensor technology that uses an organic layer of film, and that would allow us to not have to have a diode embedded in the silicon, and then that gives us the ability to put things like capacitors in the silicon, and we can do variacs, which control voltage levels. It's kind of the holy grail of what people have been looking for from Panasonic.
Sure.
We've introduced our first camera on the Pro AV side that can use it. It's an 8K box camera. It's a little black box that is a PL mount. I believe it's a Super 35 sensor. You have to forgive me. I'm not on the Pro AV side, so it's only what I've read. But it's a little black box camera. I believe it's Super 35 sensor, and you can mount your lenses to it just like you could any other Super 35 camera. It just has some limitations. The most notable limitation is that you always have to shoot at twice the frame rate for shutter speed. So the only way you get the global address is, let's say I'm doing 60 frame, I have to use a 1/120th of a second shutter speed.
Okay.
If I'm at, so that's its limitation. And it's sort of being marketed right now more as a camera for production to replace multiple camera operators. You take one 8K camera, you can shoot a wide shot of the ice at a hockey game, and then you can punch out your little 1080s from the 8K. So it helps you with tracking, things like that. And obviously it's global because of the design. And most of the time for that kind of production, it would be 60 frames because that's the deliverable for those kind of sporting events. So you're always at a 1/120th of a second shutter speed. So just keep in mind, there's still some limitations there, but we have introduced a camera that can use it. Whether or not we're going to do that in the future, I think that's ultimately going to come down to how much it costs to manufacture it. Can we get past some of the limitations of the limited shutter speed, that we can't go to longer shutter speeds with it without it having to go away from global and into a rolling shutter? I think those will ultimately dictate whether or not we ever do another camera.
Got it.
Hopefully that answers the question. That's as honest as I can be about it.
Fair enough, fair enough. Mario is asking something that I think maybe he's missing a feature that's in there, but he says, will there be a firmware update to allow 60 frames per second in the US model? Why this limitation when it doesn't exist in other regions? And of course the US model shoots 60p, so I'm not quite sure what you're missing, Mario, but the S1H absolutely shoots 4K 60 right now. So is there...
Right.
And I guess there isn't a US European model because the camera does, like the GH5, it switches between 30 hertz and 25 hertz, or I guess it's 60 hertz and 50 hertz and 24 hertz. Correct?
Right. But I do want to touch base on this because I see a lot of misuse of the 24 hertz section.
Okay.
So yeah, it absolutely is a world camera. So whether you get a European one or a US one, you're effectively getting the same basic functionality. And they all do 4K 60. Or UHD 60 for that matter. So you have both. A lot of folks, though, misinterpret when we have that 24, they assume that's like YouTube 24 or television YouTube, like television 24. That's what they assume it is. And what they don't understand is that's a true 24 frame per second.
Right.
It's not 2398.
Right.
So let's say for argument's sake, you're shooting an interview with somebody and it's like a 30-minute interview and you shot it in true 24, but you're going to deliver to television. Well, what will happen is that you bring that onto your timeline. You have a 2398 timeline, and all of a sudden the interview begins perfectly, and then all of a sudden it's a Godzilla movie at the end because the audio comes out of sync from the video because we're having to remove frames periodically, and that means that your audio is becoming a longer file than the video was. So it's important for people to understand that 24, true 24, is for cinematic presentation. That's if you're going to deliver a DCP or a digital cinema file to like a local theater. So if you're shooting something for like the film festival circuit and you have to have DCP deliverables, it's better to shoot in that 24 frame because ultimately the final file they want is true 24. A more common use for this is if I need to cut a camera with film because there is no 2398 in a Panavision camera or an Reflex that just doesn't exist. So you're going to shoot true 24 in this camera as your like B or C camera, and then it'll cut better when you're working with the film as it gets converted from film to digital content with it's called a digicine process.
Right. I remember that. Yeah. Is a telecine process. Is there? So this question might be, if this is too long of a question to get into, then just say we'll talk about this later. But if you're shooting something with the intent of both cinematic and television release, are you better to shoot in 2400 and conform to 2398 for broadcast, or shoot in 2398 and conform to 24 for cinema?
This depends, Joseph. Are you Quentin Tarantino or are you PhotoJoseph?
Wow. Gee, thanks for rubbing it in. I think I know who I am. I know my place.
Okay. I make that distinction because people like Quentin Tarantino, people like Chris Nolan, when you're at that level of skill, talent, and creativity, you can do whatever you want. And the studios are going to let you do what you want.
Sure.
But at a lower level of production, if my aspirations are theatrical and then eventually home release, usually we shoot at 23.98. And the reason for that is that conforming the audio back is much easier for us to do that way. So it gives us an easier deliverable for theatrical, and we spend less money doing the deliverable for television.
Right.
So that's where the industry has mostly gone to, at least. And keep in mind, I don't do a lot of production, and
sure.
I don't do any. I am not Chris Nolan, so I've never done a theatrical presentation. Everything I'm talking about here is academic, based on conversations I've had with studios, conversations I've had with filmmakers. This dates back to GH4 when we had the DCI deliverable, which was the 4096 by 2160, and it was in true 24 only. And people were like, "What were you doing?" Because we don't do that anymore.
Right. Interesting.
We were following to the letter of the rules what was there, but the industry had already moved to 2398.
Gotcha. So. All right. Thank you. Good answer. Revance's got an interesting question here. So why a 6K sensor instead of a 4K sensor? 6K is twice the data and can hit 30, so a sensor with half the data, like a 4K sensor, should have been able to hit full readout 4K at twice the frame rate, so 60p. So I guess saying if the sensor was limited to 4K at its full size, full 4K readout, would you be able to do 4K 60 and use the full sensor? Difficult
for me to answer because I don't know the architecture. Some of this is going to be sensor availability as well. If we can use the same basic die that we're using in like an S1 for the basis of the sensor, and then add a neutral density, optical low pass filter, and add dual gain functionality, I can buy significantly more of that sensor, producing a lower cost. Also, that sensor is going to give me access to a larger pool of those sensors. Right. If we do a dedicated bespoke sensor that was unique to the S1H, it would probably be a much more expensive sensor because we would have to completely fab that up on our own, probably from the ground up. Again, I don't know for sure. Sure. I'm only thinking as how an engineer would be thinking about this sort of thing. We could maybe source a sensor that can do it, but then what you'd end up with is maybe a lot of compromises in low light sensitivity or dynamic range. Ultimately, this sensor was available. It works beautifully, and it delivers almost everything we want. Right. Now, a lot of folks get caught up in this 60p full frame necessity, and again, I don't want to marginalize it because we would love to deliver it. There's nothing that says I don't want to deliver this. Right, of course. But you also have to look at the use case for it. So there's not a lot of people delivering 60 frame content with this type of camera. Sure. It's usually going to end up as a 24 frame deliverable or a 25 frame deliverable. That's what it's going to end up being delivered as, which means 60 frame content is used primarily as a slow-mo effect. Right. It's going to be used as a slow motion. That's why we have a 48 frame. That's why we have a 50 frame. That's why we have a 60 frame. Right. So that you can do this and deliver slow motion. And that's the most common use for it. So now I want you to imagine that we're delivering a f1.4 100mm lens, full frame coverage, depth of field that barely covers from the tip of the nose to the eyelash. I'm now doing a movement to create a slow motion effect while I'm having to maintain that ridiculously shallow depth of field. It's just not going to really be that practical. When I can crop in on that super 35 region and get substantially greater depth of field, it makes that shot easier to execute. And it's not really a need because I need a wider angle of view. There are tons of super 35 lenses available that have really wide angles of view. There's a Canon, I think it's a 10-14 available that you can throw on that camera. It's a 15mm angle of view after crop. So again, I don't want to marginalize, denigrate the need. I just want people to understand that it's not a substantial need. It's more important to have a super 35 crop and then have lenses that can cover it. And you keep in mind that there's also, within the Leica camp, just within the L mount, they have a whole series of APS-C lenses, and they have wide-angle APS-C lenses in that mount as well. So you also have access to things like focal reducers, which the industry calls speed boosters. The folks at Kipon make a whole series of focal reducers that work in the L mount, and you have the ability to then take a full frame lens, step it down, and get that full frame look on the super 35 region of the sensor. So that's also an option. Right. A lot of options. Okay. Thank you very much. I think it's very much just an interesting technical question of is it technically possible to do to get that full sensor readout, but your answers all make great sense.
Okay, this one's not going to have an answer because it's asking about a rumor, but I'll just read it so that I can address Franciscus' question. He says, I heard a rumor about Panasonic working on a new revolutionary autofocus method. Is that true? And if so, is it possible that we'll see it in the S1H at some point?
Okay. I don't mean to laugh. I know exactly what they're talking about.
I do too.
It's what do they call it? It's time of light.
Yeah, LiDAR
which
type
is
of
using. Yeah, it's using LiDAR to emit a LiDAR beam, bounce the information back into the camera.
I've seen the demo. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and well, so you probably saw the Blackmagic demo. Is that the one you'd seen? That was on EOS HD?
Maybe that's where it was. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so we obviously are working on time of light because we're doing a lot of stuff with smart automobiles. And so there's a lot of people reading articles about what we're doing in smart automobile. And I think that they are sort of forcing that on to the imaging side of the business. You got to remember that the sensor sizes that we deal with in automotive vision are much, much smaller. So the tolerances for missed focus in shallow depth of field doesn't really exist there. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that it's not accurate enough for larger sensors.
Oh, interesting.
It's not accurate enough for the shallow depths of field that people are looking for. So we don't believe you would get an improvement.
Got it.
Over what we're currently doing.
Interesting.
I know that there's been some demos that show it working, but you'll notice that it was in a very controlled environment. Right. It was a very controlled initial shoot. It required an external device that was connected to it. That doesn't mean that we might not be working on something, or we may not come up with some sort of, breakthrough on this. I just think it's highly unlikely.
Got it.
That's my assumption.
Okay, good, thank you. Mario is clarifying his question. He's the one who asked, will be a firmware update to allow 60 frames per second in the US model. What he meant was 50 frames per second. And there is, Mario. All you have to do is switch the camera from 30 hertz to, or was it 30 to 25 hertz or something?
59.94.
Yeah, because right now it's...
59.94.
Right now, the camera, when you open and take it out of the box in the US, it is set to the US frequencies, which are divisors of 2997. If you want true 25p, you go into the settings and you switch it from the 30 hertz to the 25 hertz mode, and now you have true 25p, 50p, and other variables of the 25. So it's all in the camera. You just have to go in and switch the modes to do that. And that's where you also would switch to true 24 hertz for 24.00 frames per second, if that's what you wanted. All right.
And I guess, Joseph, I just want to make sure, he might be asking about the S1, though, because the S1H, it's clear it has PAL and NTSC, which would do those things.
Right.
We've heard some requests for the S1 to get like a 50 hertz mode. So we're listening to it, and we're considering it. I can't promise anything, but we're absolutely looking.
Okay. Yeah, Mario, he didn't say which camera. He just said firmware update. So if that is the case, then maybe that's what you're asking, Mario. All right, moving on. So let's see. David says, on the GH5, when recording, some settings get locked out until recording is stopped, such as punching and unfocusing and taking the waveform on and off. Is this the same on the S1H? And I'll add to that to say, why is that the case on either camera?
So in terms of the waveform monitor, you mean to be able to remove it so that it can hit the display button and not have it up anymore? I can't answer that one. The punch-in for autofocus, for manual focus, I can answer that. It's an engine limitation, and it's just something in the way we design the flow of data prevents us from being able to do that. Because ultimately, in the data path as it's being, from the sensor to the card, our data path would ultimately add that punch-in into the video.
Which is the same thing that you get on the HDMI out. If you connect the camera to an Atomos monitor, Atomos recorder, when you punch in on the sensor on the camera, you see that punch in on the HDMI out, which means if you are not recording in camera, so you do have the ability to zoom in, punch in, but you are recording on the Atomos, you will get that punch in your recording, and your shot is now destroyed.
Right. And so it's just it's a data flow limitation. Ultimately, where the punch-in is created would be at a point where it would ultimately embed itself into the final video file. So it won't do it. Now, in the future, with new cameras, possibly that'll be rectified. We've heard the request many times. at this point, it's just not possible with the engine.
Yeah, I would say the workaround right now, if that's something that you really need, is using the external monitor and doing the punch-in on the external monitor. So again, on an Atomos recorder or just monitor, you can punch in for critical focus while recording because it's not. Well, actually, I shouldn't say. I don't know if you're recording on the Atomos recorder. I don't know if you can punch in.
You can punch in.
You can punch in while recording. Okay.
Yeah, during recording you can. Yeah.
Okay.
But again, that's adding a kind of a Band-Aid, right? I had to add a solution to the camera.
Of course. Just saying that's an option.
So, we wanted to. We want you to be able to do it. Sometimes we just can't do it due to the limitations of the engine architecture.
Got it. All right, Cinegains comes back and he says, or she says, so every company seems to neglect their crop sensor cameras now in favor of full frame, with the crop sensor cameras under threat of smartphones, apparently. We haven't seen a Nikon APS-C in quite a while. The new Canon and Sony APS-C cameras are quite a bit of the old stuff with a slight twist. I hope this won't be the case for Micro Four Thirds. How significant is the dedication to the crop sensor for Panasonic? Will we still be wowed?
Yeah, we're walking away from it. We're not gonna.
You can't say stuff like that because someone's going to clip that, meme it, and that's,
I know, they're
that's
gonna
the end
just
of it.
clip that little piece out.
Yeah.
I know it. So we just launched a 10 to 25 f1.7 constant aperture lens.
Gorgeous lens.
That is a very unique lens in the marketplace. It's a risk because it's something that hasn't really been available before. The idea of a 20 to 50 and that fast an aperture range is pretty unheard of. We're absolutely going to continue to work on Micro Four Thirds sensor cameras. We think they have very different market niches, and even Yamane-san, who is the director of our entire imaging business, he has come out and said, we see market needs for a GH5 replacement and the S1H, and that they can live together and they can work together. We're never going to be able to get the lens sizes that we can achieve in Micro Four Thirds. Until that OPF material that somebody asked about earlier, until that can become a reality, we'll probably never be able to get the readout speeds that we can get in Micro Four Thirds. So, people who like 4K 60 and full sensor output, well, that's why the GH5 can do that.
Right.
And that's why the S1H can't. It's just not possible on a sensor that's the size of what we have in the S1H.
Right.
So things like faster slow-mo functionality, larger uses of the sensor with less cropping, lower heat generation, the smaller size, all of those things play a role. And Micro Four Thirds is not a small sensor. I will go to my deathbed saying this is not a small sensor. It is a large sensor. It's not full frame large, but it's within punching distance of where APS-C is.
Right.
And the Micro Four Thirds sensors that we're releasing in cameras like the GH5 do many more things than what you can do with an APS-C camera. There just aren't that many 4K 60 options, even in the APS-C world.
Right.
There's certainly not 180 frame or 240 frame options that are out there in those cameras. So we clearly see benefit. We clearly see a need for it. And I think ultimately the market is going to enjoy having that Micro Four Thirds option for certain applications and having full frame for other applications.
Yeah. Fair enough.
So I don't know. We've got this question a lot, and we've said it over and over again. We're committed to Micro Four Thirds. We're going down with the ship on this because we are that passionate about what the system can deliver.
Yeah, I'll add to that I think that it was very smart for Panasonic to release that 10 to 25 at the same time as the S1 was announced, or announced at the same time the S1 was released, just to drive that point home that this is not a move away from Micro Four Thirds. It is still absolutely something that you're actively developing and developing for. That lens is, like you said, it's unique, it's fantastic, and it's not an afterthought. And that lens is not like designed in 5 minutes and released just to appease the masses. Clearly, that took a considerable amount of effort. I personally am very much looking forward to whatever happens to be next. And as much as I love the S1, S1H, the full frame shooting, I still absolutely love shooting Micro Four Thirds. And if I'm going to grab a camera to run out the door with, or I'm going to go on a trip, unless I have an absolute need for that full frame, I frankly would rather be carrying around a bag full of Micro Four Thirds gear. That has always been the case. That's what I've always said. That's why I switched to Micro Four Thirds, and that hasn't changed just because the S1H is out. And the S1 is out. They're great cameras, obviously, but different things for different types of shooting. All right, let's see here. Moving on. David says, will the new native lenses, and he's not specifying micro four thirds or full frame, so we're going to assume full frame here. Will the new native lenses have a linear focus ring? I.e., if using follow focus, will you be able to repeat the moves? And I think he's referring to like the 50-1.4 has that lockdown manual focus ring. Is that something we're going to see in specialized lenses, or is that going to be all L-mount lenses from Panasonic? Where does that fall in?
So it's difficult for me to see the future and know for sure exactly what we're going to do. I can tell you as of right now what our design methodology is for lenses. So in lenses that are in the gray S, so we have two different logos. We have a red S logo and we have a gray S. The red S ones will be notified on the front as being pro. Those are the pro lenses.
Right.
The gray ones are more of the high-level consumer lenses, which I hate because that 24-105 is way too good to be considered that. But
it really is a very good lens.
I mean, that lens, it replaces a macro lens. It is so good at close focus distance. It's most people's macro. But what's important to understand is that we have certain things we're doing that are different on the gray versus the red. So on the red lenses, you'll have the ability to pull back a clutch, and that'll give you your focus distances on the lens, and then it becomes a mechanical focus system. If you slide it up and turn the manual focus on the back of the camera on, now you're into the focus by wire system.
Right.
And when we're in the focus by wire system, in the camera's menu, and this is S1H, this is S1, this is S1R, this is just S, you have the ability to set it to either a non-linear focus for photography, so it's fast, and as you turn it, it gets exponentially faster, or you can set it to linear, and when you set it to linear, it'll be repeatable. And you can even change the degrees of rotation. So if I want a 360-degree throw on that lens, I can do that. If I'm a single camera operator, 360 is going to be a nightmare, especially at 180 frames per second. So I can also set it to a 90-degree throw and almost anything in between. So in addition, we're really conscientious of focus breathing. So these lenses have very, very low occurrences of focus breathing.
Yep.
So they pull focus beautifully. And they're not parfocal. I want to make sure that's clear. Parfocal is an element effect that for those who don't know what that means, I can set my zoom for like a stage. I got people on stage. I can set zoom on the close subject, set the focus there. When I go wide, it'll keep on focus on that person. When I zoom in again, it'll be on focus again. So I can just set focus once and then zoom in and out. That's what that means. When you set the camera to manual focus, we will still move the autofocus elements so that it behaves like a parfocal design. So when you're on that 24-105, the 70-200, the 24-70, I'm sure the 70-200 new one that we've announced, and I'm sure the 16-35, they'll all give you kind of that parfocal behavior. So they're very video-centric. Now, I can't speak to the future. We may do some budget lenses at some point that, we can't budget those sort of improvements in. But in the short term, with what you're seeing in our lens roadmap, I fully expect that stuff to continue.
Right. Fair enough. Thank you very much. Joshua is asking where you can get a LUMIX S shirt like yours, and someone responded with the email address jobs@panasonic.com.
There's a story about this. I had to make this shirt myself.
Really?
Because we had to use them. Yeah, we had to use them I didn't stitch it myself. I went to a place that embroiders. That's how I got it. Go to H&M, you can buy the shirt there, and then you can get it embroidered.
Oh my God, that's funny. That is pretty funny. Cinegane is adding, personally, I loved the Olympus Pro manual focus D-clutch. Not sure why Panasonic went with this new style without hard stops that doesn't allow for us to use with focus pulling and repeatable stops. I think what he's talking about is when you're in the clutched mode and you rotate it, the Panasonic lenses have a soft stop. You feel it stop, but the ring still physically turns. Is there a technical reason to not go that way, or an advantage to go this way?
It was just a design reason. The engineers have never given us a clear answer.
Right. Okay. Here's an easy one from Revance. It says, ask, can the S1H save over USB to external SSD storage?
No.
That's what I thought.
Well, it can't. It's not like some of the cameras. I think Blackmagic now has the ability to do that over USB 3. We don't have that ability.
Right. Yeah, the USB 3 port charging, tethered shooting, right? Tethered photography goes through that, but not the video dump. Okay.
Right.
Sharbox is asking, can we please have phase detect autofocus in the GH6?
I have no idea.
No idea.
that's an engineering question.
Will the S1H? Yeah, we don't need to go down that. We can't speculate on anything, and anything we do know we couldn't say anyway. So we'll just leave it at that. Joshua's asking, will the S1H offer a grip like the S1 and the S1R? I'll answer that for you. It already does. The same grip that is out for the S1 and the S1R works on the S1H. It's the same one. Cinegain's very happy. He has the 10 to 25 on order right now. Let's see here. We've got looks like some clarification on the electronic ND. I'm just going to read this whole thing. It says, regarding the electronic ND in the Sony FS5 and FS7 cameras, the electronic NDs actually can be removed. The FS7 II gets an electronic neutral density filter, which is continuously variable from 1/4 to 1/28 strength, similar to the one on the FS5. It can also be completely disengaged when unneeded and is automatically replaced with clear glass. So physical swapping.
Sorry, didn't know that.
Okay.
Didn't know that.
That's those are physically much larger cameras.
Yeah. It also has no shutter. There's
Right.
no electronic.
Yeah. So that goes back to the whole thing. Why is there? Yeah, the electronic shutter. Getting errors on my screen.
It goes right back to what I said. It's the E-mount. It's about 18 millimeter flange back distance. We're at 20 millimeters. It's making a design decision, and that's the FS7. It's not really intended to be a photo camera.
Great. Awesome. Our good friend Caleb Pike has a question that I know we talked about back at the event, and I'm very glad he's here to ask it because I think this is a great suggestion. He says, will we ever see high frame rate manual exposure on the S1? The S1H has plenty of features that separate the two. Why disable manual exposure on the S1? Also, he adds that Matt and the S1H are awesome. Thank you for all the hard work you do.
Well, the S1H is awesome. I don't know about Matt, but so Caleb, I wish we could have talked more at the event in Los Angeles. I feel bad that you didn't get a chance to spend any time talking, but we are listening to the market. We have heard the concerns over not having the ability to manually control exposure when using the high-speed mode, because that camera doesn't get VFR, it gets high-speed. So we're listening. We've submitted the request to our engineers in Japan. Obviously, I'm sure we have other firmware updates planned. If there's no technical reason why we can't, hopefully we can do it.
Yeah.
So it's not something that I watched your video, Caleb, and it's not what you had implied. I'm not going to say the brand you had implied we're trying to be like. I don't think that was the reason that we did it, but we are listening to the market, and if it's possible, we'll try to do it.
Sure. Makes sense. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Caleb, for the question. Blas says, a naive and basic question. Why do different camera makers choose different mounts even for the same sensor size? Is it a technical issue or is it economic policy? That's a really good question. Why is there a Canon and Nikon and L mount and all these other things? Why not just have a universal full frame mount? Whose dumb idea was this to begin with?
Okay, so wow, this gets in the weeds a lot.
That's history. But, yeah. No, if there's a technical reason, let's. Yeah, I was gonna say, if there's a technical reason, by all means, let's hear it. But I would imagine a lot of it is just economics of the original camera manufacturers saying, no, we're going to make a body. We want them to buy our lenses.
Yeah, so whoever designs a mount first, they get to patent it or trademark it or anything like that, and then they ultimately get to play by the rules they want to play by, right? So if they want to make it an open mount, they can let people license it or charge for it.
Like the L mount.
Yeah, so in the case of the L mount, ultimately, so I can talk a little bit about why we did what we did, which is, I know we had investigated doing our own mount, and ultimately we looked at what the L mount had to offer and what our plan was, and they were so close to each other that it just doesn't make a lot of sense for us to try to go it alone and not have an inbuilt accessory option available already, because there were a lot of accessories already available for the L mount. I mean, it was the second full frame mirrorless mount just after Sony. It's been around a long time. So there are a lot of accessories already for it. There are already lenses available for it. Now, we can question the costs, but if you haven't shot with some of those lenses, you just don't even know. I mean, they're apochromatic. They're ridiculously good lenses. But I understand they're a little more expensive than what some people want to spend. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that we already have an inbuilt catalog of lenses that work with the system now. We have an inbuilt catalog of accessories that were already ready for the system. Frankly, when we announced the S series, and that was going to be L mount, you saw this rapid deployment of additional accessories that people started doing because they could quickly go out and buy or rent an L mount camera and start working on their accessories for it. So there was a lot of reasons that we chose what we did. You could kind of have to ask Canon or Nikon or Sony why they choose not to share.
Sure.
That's our story, at least.
Nice. Very good. David is asking, following up on the linear focus and the features you were talking about that the S1 has as far as being able to define the range of focus and go into linear, nonlinear, drive-by-wire. He's saying basically, can that be added to the Micro Four Thirds? He's got a GH5, he's got the 12-35 and the 35-100. Fantastic pairing, fantastic combination. Could that feature be added to those via firmware update?
That is a terrific question, and we don't know. So we've asked. We love the nonlinear functionality of the S1. We really like being able to set the rotation. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I don't know if there's a limitation in the hardware in the lenses that prevent that from happening,
right,
or if it's just a firmware update. So we've asked for it. We'll see what's possible. It may not be possible right now on existing camera bodies, but maybe on future camera bodies. Mm-hmm. Or it might not be possible just because of limitations in the lenses that we're doing now. Right. I know that's a non-answer, but I want people to understand that we're listening. We've asked for it. Believe me, we love it in the S1. And I'm a GH5 shooter. That's what I shoot. So I shoot GX85 for photography. I shoot GH5 for almost everything I do video-wise. Other than this, I'm on an S1 right now. So the long and short of it is I want these things just as much as you guys do, because I like the smaller, lighter weight G-series cameras. So I'll keep pushing for them if you keep asking for them. If I think you got something cool that I would want, I'm going to ask, because I'll ultimately use it as well.
What is the best way for any consumer, anybody watching, to submit a request to make sure that Panasonic hears that that is a feature that they want? Is there a form? Is there a website, an email address? Is it just be loud on social media and hope it rises to the top? What's their best way of getting that information to ensure that it's heard?
That's a difficult question for me to ask, because you don't really have like a forum that we follow per se. I do know that we follow really closely the Facebook user groups for the GH5, GH5S, S1, S1H. Sure. We follow those user groups really, really closely. And we're slowly getting better at monitoring social media. So you're going to see a lot more presence with our brand when it comes to following specific forums. There'll be more information about that coming in the coming months. But I would say that the best ways to reach out to us are the way people have been doing it now. You can comment on the Facebook groups I just mentioned. You can always hit us on Instagram, or you can hit us on Twitter. And,
and there is the Panasonic call center. I mean, you can call into the support line, and you can give your feedback there. And I know for a fact that that information does make its way into the powers that need to hear it.
I just want to make sure people know we have heard the autofocus questions. So I'm not trying to get you to stop asking them. I'm just telling you we've already heard them, and we're always feeding that up.
Fair enough.
We're obviously feeding up everything about the linear versus nonlinear function.
Yeah.
But I don't want people to stop asking the question. I just want them to understand that we are listening. We do pay attention.
But do keep asking. I think it's important to say keep asking. Like as an example, one of my favorite features that was in the S1H that was not talked about anywhere, but I found it in the menus and I just about jumped out of my chair. I was so excited, was the ability to have a red box around the LCD when you're recording. You hit the record button, you see a big red box around it. And I included it in my video because I'm so excited about this. It's something we've been asking for a long time. And it's there, I'm sure, because a lot of people asked for it. It's something that Panasonic heard over and over again. And by Panasonic, I mean not you personally, but back in corporate, back in Japan, they heard about it enough from us, from the public at large, that it did get added. And so those kind of things, they're possible. It does happen. And that wouldn't be there if we hadn't been asking for it.
There's actually, I can name a specific one too, which is anamorphic. So anamorphic in the GH4 happened because of the feedback we got from the marketplace. And I realize anamorphic lenses are still not quite at the price range where a lot of people could shoot in it.
They're getting there.
I think you're going to start to see more and more of those options. I think this IBC, you're probably going to see a lot of lens announcements, I suspect. And that all started with the GH4 and really a groundswell of requests from the market.
Right. Very good. Here's a great question. Cinegane asks, would it be possible to have an IBIS camera, so a camera with in-body image stabilization, that has a feature to physically lock the sensor in place when IBIS is turned off? Because the way it is now, of course, for anybody who's unsure, it is essentially a floating sensor. Magnets control it, keep it stable when the camera moves, and when you turn off stabilization, all that's happening is the magnets are locking it in place as much as they can, but a hard jolt to the camera will move it, which is why the GH5S does not have a floating sensor so that it is rock solid even when mounting it to something like a car. So with that in mind, could it be possible to have some kind of a physical arms grab onto that thing and hold onto it in the camera?
So first I want to go back to the GH5S comment, which is that we gave it a hard-mounted sensor for the use on automobiles or to deal with that kind of shock impact. That is a byproduct. It's not the reason. The reason that we did a non-stabilized sensor in that camera is that it's a physically larger sensor than what we put in a GH5. It's like a 1/8 crop. It's not a 2 crop. And the reason we could do that is that when Olympus and Panasonic developed the Micro Four Thirds mount, it was designed to have a larger than necessary circle of light from the lens to accommodate stabilization. So the stabilizer wouldn't move itself into the shadow regions of the lens, so it wouldn't vignette as it stabilizes. So it was always designed from the ground up to accommodate a larger sensor. And in fact, the GH1 had a physically larger sensor.
Oh, really?
It was a multi-aspect sensor. And because we at the time felt that optical stabilization was the superior technology, we elected to use that extra area for a bigger sensor versus using the extra area for stabilization. So when you're building a camera that's designed for high sensitivity, every micron of diode area you can gets you better low light sensitivity. Going to a physically larger sensor means physically larger diodes, which means better low light sensitivity. That's why we did that. The byproduct of this is that it's better for car mounts and things like that. But that wasn't the reason. The reason is that we wanted a physically larger sensor. I think we didn't do a good job of communicating that message with the GH5S launch. I think the easy story was to say, oh, if you mount it to a car, it's going to be better. But it's harder to get into the technical benefits of having that larger sensor and the larger diode area. That's why we did it. So with that said, anything is theoretically possible with locking down that sensor. But I think people need to understand, you're talking about a 20 millimeter flange back distance, right, for us to get the light to the sensor. If you have a 0.5 millimeter off in mounting that sensor so that it's not, let's say that the lens is here, we're parallel to the lens as the light's coming in. If you're like 0.5 millimeter off, all of a sudden that side of the lens is going to look out of focus, or it's going to look like the miniature effect when you use a tilt shift lens.
Right.
And so it's not as simple as people make it out to be, that you could just mount it into place or bolt it into place or have little robot arms that move in and hold it into place. I'm not going to say we're not working on solutions that could do that. Obviously, our engineers are always working on things.
Sure, of course.
But I want people to understand a fraction of a millimeter off, and it's going to throw your focus off. Right. And so it will have to be a well thought out solution and not something that's just a quick and simple fix.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think the biggest limitation is just going to be the space, but anything is possible. We don't know all the answers. Interesting question here from Shark. He's asking, I know you're working with Atomos to pre-release ProRes RAW for the S1H. Will that be possible to release ProRes RAW for the GH5 and GH5S?
That's a terrific question, and I have no idea. I have no idea if we're working on that or not. We'll have to see. The S1H is obviously a much newer camera. It's not a much newer architecture than those two cameras are. So there might be some technical limitation in the camera. If we were to do it, it might require something similar to what's going on with Nikon, where you might have to send it in and we have to do a whole PCB change out. And then the question becomes, by the way, I don't know if that's what Nikon's doing. I'm just saying that we might have to do something like that. And ultimately, if it's so close to when we're launching a new camera, is it even worth your while to do it? I don't know. Right. So I guess the short answer is no idea if we're going to do it. No idea if the architecture's in the camera to even allow it. We know the S1H is the newest camera in the line. Clearly, it was designed with this in mind
from the
to
ground
be able
up,
to do this. So there may be technical limitations.
Right, it's fair enough.
And I'm saying there may. It may not be. We'll have to see.
There you go. Ryan is asking, and I think we just answered your question, Ryan, is there going to be ProRes RAW for the S1? Oh, for the S1, not the S1H. So he's asking, will there be ProRes RAW for the S1?
I'm going to default to the same answer.
Same answer, yeah.
I don't know if there's hardware limitations in the S1 that are not in the S1H.
Yeah.
So we haven't publicly said in one way or the other.
There you go. And other people, Gabriel's asking basically the same thing. He'd love to see RAW on the S1. And I think it's fair to say that, like Caleb's point about the manual exposure and variable frame rate, putting that into the S1 versus the S1H, there's still a massive differentiation between the two. But I personally think that having RAW exclusive to the S1H is a perfectly acceptable thing to require. If you want RAW, then you go to the S1H. That's the camera that does it. But that's just my opinion, obviously not speaking for anybody there. Ravans is pointing out, you said you were following the Facebook groups and everything else. He's saying, please also follow the Reddit groups. I don't know if you follow Reddit groups on the Panasonic Reddit groups. Just for looking
Reddit?
For... Exactly.
Sorry. Yeah, we follow Reddit.
Follow those as well.
We do.
Awesome. Let's see here. In addition to the start-stop button, what functions can be controlled by a hand grip? I'm assuming you mean the vertical grip. Is it possible to build a shoulder rig and control aperture and shutter speed from a hand grip that is attached to the camera via cable? Oh, I see. So can you get camera control, external camera control, by plugging something in, whether it's USB or whatever else, into the camera? Or maybe the question is, how much can you control externally on the camera?
Okay, so there's two different inputs, right? We have the remote input. That's the one that like photographers would use for like a remote shutter. But we've hidden some features there. So you actually can do remote start-stop from that port. You can also control zoom. Obviously, none of the S1 lenses have power zoom, so that doesn't really do much. Right. But on a GH5, GH5S, we have a couple of power zoom lenses. It'll control zoom there as well. So you can toggle zoom out through that. We also have the USB port on the side. Right. And you're familiar with the tethering function. I'm sure Joseph, you've used the tethering function.
Absolutely.
So you know that from your laptop, you can control the aperture, shutter speed, ISO, record function. You can do all that stuff. Yeah, so our friends at DJI, they already make the Ronin S, and it can pull focus. It can also trigger record and pause. And there's really nothing that would limit, an inventor or somebody who wants to figure out how we do that control. There's nothing that would limit them from being able to make control iris or anything else in our lenses. Right. Whatever can be controlled through our Panasonic LUMIX Tether app would be controllable through that USB interface.
Is that that's an open API anybody can develop for those controls?
It's not open, but requests can be made, and we're happy to listen to requests.
Got it. Okay. Fair enough.
By the way, for requests for people who are planning on making accessories for it. Right. We're happy to listen.
Cinegaine's following up on the idea of submitting feature ideas, saying, I once contacted Panasonic about a 1-inch super zoom like the RX10 from Sony after having been a fan of the f2.8 constant aperture FZ200. They said they'd forward it to the development department, and voila, a little while later, the FZ1000 appeared. He says, I must have had something to do with it. We hope that you did. The FZ1000 is a great little camera. It still blows me away how awesome that camera is. Blas says, how are the... Okay, you're definitely not going to be able to answer this, but I'll still read his question. How are the pre-release sales of the S1H going? Presumably the LUMIX S line will not reach the LUMIX GH popularity. Which item is selling better between the S1H, S1, and S1R? And what are sales projections? Yeah, Blas, I'm just going to answer that for Matt. Sales projections are not something that are publicly disclosed ever. So even if Matt knows, he's not going to be able to say it. So I'm just going to save him the trouble of saying I can't answer that question. All right, that brings us to the end of the questions in the chat room. For those who, I see a few people still talking over in the YouTube room, so I'll give you a couple more minutes. We are going to wrap this up within the next 10 minutes. If you have questions that you've been dropping in YouTube and you haven't gotten answered, this is where you got to go. PhotoJoseph.com/live, as it says here. That's where you got to submit your questions. We're keeping them all in one place so that people can upvote their favorite questions. Although I will say, most questions have just been going in there, and I've been getting to most of them. But still, put them in there so we can keep them all in one place. That would be awesome. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap this up? And then hopefully we'll get a couple more questions in here. Oh, look, they already came in. Anything that you want to add that we haven't covered yet, or people haven't asked that you feel like people should know, or maybe misinformation that might be out there that you want to clear up about the S1H?
So I don't know. Are you going to go to a question? You said was
No, go ahead. Go
want-
ahead. Go ahead if you have got something to add.
Well, I have a question actually for you, because
Okay.
you got to attend our launch event.
I did. That was fun.
That we held. So what did you think of the Dolby Vine Theater and what we did there?
That place is great. It's so funny because you go into the theater, it's like right next to a strip club and an ice cream parlor, and you're thinking, man, what is this place? Where are we going? And you step inside this dingy exterior, and it's this glorious Dolby theater that is just mind-blowing. I wish that we could have come back there that night to watch a movie. I wanted to see some projection, some full movie projected on that thing. That event space is great. It was great to see everything on that huge and obviously amazing screen. And I think one of the other guests made the point, I don't remember if they made this publicly when we were in the room or said it later, but that for Panasonic to show off the S1H footage on what is quite simply the single best projector in Hollywood really shows how much confidence Panasonic had in that camera and in the content that it was creating. And I think that's an extremely valid point to make. It's easy to hold an event and say, look at how good our footage is. Oh, we've got this $200 projector from Best Buy. It could be better, but this is as good as it gets on this projector. It's the projector's limitation. You couldn't point out any flaws and say, oh, it's the projector that's doing it. If there are any flaws, it clearly was the camera, and I don't think that we saw anything. It just looked absolutely gorgeous. So I think it was a great way to show it off. Ballsy and awesome way to do it.
Yeah, so we did 5 different color grades effectively for that project. Not just the 5 different films. I'm talking each film had 5 different grades.
Okay.
So we did a DCP for regular cinema in the P3 space, so that if we wanted to, we could do showings in other markets on it, right? We still have the Dolby Vision one for, if we wanted to rent an AMC theater and do something like that. But we also did a Dolby Vision for television authoring, which we'll be able to use at trade shows and other things like that. I'd love to be able to get those into people's hands because they are ridiculous. They look amazing. We did an HDR10 and we did a standard dynamic range. So it was pretty shocking when you're at Dolby and they take you to their facility in Burbank, which is different than where you were, and you get to see this Pulsar monitor, which is a 4,000 nit monster display that they use for color grading. And like the shots from David C. Smith, which are like the motorcyclist in the canyon, you have no idea how bright those headlights are or how well shot that was, because there's all this limitation in brightness in our current TVs and our laptops and everything. When it was shown on that 4,000 nit monitor, you could see how much brighter it is in the center of the headlight versus the outer edges of the headlight. It was outrageous. I don't think people know how good David shot his footage until you see it in the Dolby Vision content. The Dolby Vision content, it's amazingly good. So it was fun to be able to work that project. I learned an awful lot about production, in particular post-production process, and some of the challenges that are associated with it. But Dolby's an amazing company, and the stuff that they do is really revolutionary.
It was awesome. There is no doubt about that. No doubt at all. All right, getting to the last couple of questions here. Shark is asking if there's another firmware update planned for the GH5 or GH5S. I don't think anything has been announced, and if not, then there's probably no answer other than that. But is there anything announced that I may have missed?
We haven't announced anything, no.
Okay. All right, fair enough. Cinegane again says, I have an XGIMI projector. Don't know what that is. It's nice to have a large projector in front of you. It's the immersion. I also recently bought an LG OLED 55C8. Image looks nice, though not quite bright enough in broad daylight. Colors and motion look much better than your generic TV set. I don't think there was a question in there, Cinegane, so congratulations on your monitor purchase. Jeffrey Wright, a little off topic, but I'm trying to reach Panasonic warranty support, and it's been a nightmare. Ooh, sorry to hear that. My lens release button stayed depressed after the 24-105 was removed, so now I can't remount the lens. Oh my, who do I talk to? Well, definitely warranty support. There's a phone number on the box, right? Phone number in the manual that you call.
1-800-211-PANA.
There you go. There's the number for you.
Or you can also go to Panasonic.com, go to service, and you can actually just register for service right there on our website, and you send it down to McAllen, Texas, and we'll repair it.
Very good. That's a good good way to point out the new Panasonic Pro support. Now I'm forgetting the name of it. What's it called?
Professional services.
Professional services. Yeah. I really should know these specs. Hopefully you do, Tom. If Tom was here, he'd be yelling at me that I don't know these off the top of my head. But the professional support service that is now an option for Panasonic users if you're using the Pro cameras, that is a way to get accelerated support for your camera. And even, I don't know if the top tier is available yet or if it's something that's coming, but to be able to get loaner gear. I'm not sure where the status of all that is, but that is definitely something. I should do a show on that. Actually do my homework and understand everything about it first. Cinegane asking if Panasonic's going to be at IBC. I'm sure they are. You going?
Yeah, I would expect it. I mean, if Atomos is to be believed in what they announced on Raw and what we're going to do, I would hope we'd be there.
Yeah, so. No doubt, no doubt. Marco's got a question. Then we'll make this the last question on here. Is it possible? That's interesting. Is it possible to use the interface on the bottom of the camera for remote control? Basically, because the battery grip already does that. So those multi-pin surface on the bottom. Could someone else design something that attaches to that and controls externally? Interesting.
I guess anything's possible. Whether or not someone would want to make the investment to do it is another topic entirely. I personally think it's much easier just to do it through the USB interface.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. And then you wouldn't have to worry about how the camera's mounted because that would get in the way of your tripod mount. Yeah, I think it makes more sense just go through the USB-C. Okay. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. This has been great, Matt. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody who asked questions. We had a full buffet of questions here, which was awesome. I really, really appreciate all the good ones that came in. If you guys think of something later that you didn't get to ask or somehow I missed your question on here, hit me up on Twitter, @PhotoJoseph on Twitter. It's a great way to get your questions out there. If there's something that I can't answer, I'll be sure to ask Matt, and I'll try and get an answer for you. But other than that, Matt, thank you again for tuning in today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, everybody out there, for your questions, and keep asking for new features. We'll happily listen, and what we can do, we'll add.
There you go. That's right. It's great. I just, from personal experience, I know it's awesome to see a feature that you've been asking for to show up in the camera. It's really nice to see that. You're like, yes, I don't know if it was me, but I'm going to say it was me because I asked for it, and there it is. So that was my feature.
It was 100% you, Joseph. Nothing else. It was all you.
That's all I needed. All right. Thanks a bunch. Thank you, everybody. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.